I do have a very caring interest in what I write about. I don't. I think it's important because so much of what I say can sound so nihilistic and judgmental, even. I think that with such a sensitive topic, sexuality and our personal lives, it's very important to me that my readers feel that, you know, yes, perhaps I am judging you a bit.
Mm,
Perhaps
mm,
I am, I'm not approaching this with from an entirely abstract perspective. But
yeah.
at the end of the day, I'm not judging you because I think I'm superior to you. It's
Mm.
because I genuinely want to help you, and I think everybody uh needs to judge each other a bit in order uh to lend any sort of progress.
So anyway, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Magdalene Taylor. And Magdalene is a writer and critic of sex and culture. And she's written for the New York Times, and I've read her pieces there, and GQ, New York Magazine, Wall Street Journal, and I've read her pieces there, The Guardian, and I've read her pieces there, and Vice and more. She publishes a Substack newsletter called Many Such Cases. And she recently wrote an article that I read and then invited her to come talk about, as well as other things. And that's the tech oligarchy is stealing your sexuality. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you to please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you listen there, and to my Substack commentary. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And if you go there, you'll always be the first to get my stuff that goes on YouTube and anywhere else. And this is streaming on YouTube, and then we'll stay there and then be reposted as podcasts everywhere. So the first thing I want to say, Magdalene, before we get into it, is that I'm a real fan of yours. I always look for your stuff. When I see your name pop up, I read it. And this will be a weird introduction, but this is more of a conversation than an interview. I'm 72 and you're younger, and I write about family relationships, and I come out of a very weird, dysfunctional kind of background. My dad was an evangelical luminary of the religious right in the 70s and 80s, and I fled that, went into the movie business in Hollywood, directed four very mediocre, forgettable Hollywood feature films, have written a bunch of books, some of which have been quite successful, both novels and nonfiction. But my own journey is very connected to my background, whether I'm reacting against it, trying to apologize for what we did, or journey beyond it. So I'm going to ask you something before we get into what you write about sex, which I really enjoy, and relationships. And I think you really are well grounded and sensible, which for me is a very high compliment these days to call somebody sensible, and balanced and wonderful and articulate and all the rest of it. But before we went live and I introduced you, we were talking a little bit about your background, and you have some blacksmiths that go way back when in American history. But if people come to my writing and try to figure out why is he writing what he's writing, eventually they've got to understand that I draw on my own background in both fiction and nonfiction in a memoir kind of sense. But even when I'm not, it's connected. So since you write about relationships and sexuality and the points of view of men and women about each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and take a deep dive into those subjects, I'd like to ask you where that comes from, in the sense of, like, for instance, when I write about evangelicals, I'm reacting against who my parents were. When I write about the Roman Catholic Church, I know a little bit what I'm talking about because we would work with people like archbishops and popes and other people when we were in the pro-life movement back in the 70s. My stuff doesn't come out of a vacuum. And I notice when I read your work in the essays I've read, um, I haven't seen any allusions to your own personal history in those, in the sense that would explain to me who your mom is, who your dad is, whether you were raised religious, do you have siblings? Um, what are your own aspirations in terms of relationships? In other words, I'd like to get through the personal stuff for a little bit so I can understand you better. And then I'm not going to talk this much for the rest of the interview. I'm going to ask you about your essays, but can we just go there to the extent that you feel comfortable?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Okay,
Uh,
who are you?
Okay. Well, so I don't really pinpoint my area of expertise and what I like to write about anywhere in my past. I don't think that I did not have some kind of like sexually liberated parents and family life or anything like that that would have pushed me towards this, nor did I have a restricted childhood that would
Yeah,
also push me in this direction. I think that I'm very lucky to have uh, supportive, open-minded parents, but neither of them would consider themselves intellectuals or particularly knowledgeable about the sorts of things that I write about. My mother was worked for an insurance company, and my father was uh, for some of my childhood, he was a DJ on the radio, but he himself was a high school dropout
mm,
and was disabled for most of my childhood, actually. Um, so neither of them are very, either restrictive or
sure.
permissive.
Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have two older siblings, and my older brother has cerebral palsy. It affects him physically and mentally. So that was an influence in my childhood, having a disabled sibling. And yeah, there was also a really large history of drug and alcohol abuse within my family that certainly. I think that, if one really wanted to dig down into my childhood and why I am the way that I am today and what I write about, perhaps that sort of instability
Mm,
would lend to a person being interested in similarly unstable topics,
yeah.
perhaps.
Well, there's
Yeah.
a note that runs through your work that has made me very fond of you as a person and a writer. And again, this is an odd way to put it. But you go through what you write about in each topic, and then you wind up with a couple of paragraphs, usually near the end of your article, on what I would call a little, and forgive me if this sounds condescending, but sort of big sister advice to people, as in, when all is said and done, you should be experiencing relationships. When all is said and done, men and women hating each other or saying they do, even if it's just a small slice of the clickbait margin, isn't really such a good idea. And that's one thing that makes me very fond of you as a human being, because you actually have some empathy and compassion. So you'll go through your facts, and we're going to go through some of these articles, but then you may not talk about yourself personally a lot in there, but you do step up when it comes to not leaving your reader just thinking everything's fine. This is just a academic subject. Isn't it interesting that an X percentage of Korean women say this about men? Isn't it interesting that the mansphere is doing such and such? At the end, somebody reading your work could walk away with some decent advice. So the first question I have before I go to the actual essays and talk about them is, where does that come from? Because there's a kind of a pastoral quality, if I can say that, to your work that I find very interesting, as in, yeah, you actually care about your reader and you want to leave them a little better off than you found them. Am I imagining that, or is that true?
I,
Because
I
I
I
feel
think
that
I
in
think
your
that's
pieces.
absolutely right, and I very much appreciate such a generous interpretation um, of of that perspective. Yeah, I do think that is I do very much ultimately care about my readers and the world around me, and it's interesting that you said older sister type of perspective. I do think looking back into my childhood, well, and my family relations today, I am the youngest child, but I very much took on the older sibling
Yeah.
role, and there's also certainly an element of the child parenting the parent, I think is something I experienced a lot of growing up. And so I do think perhaps that is part of it. I do have a very uh caring interest in what I write about. I don't I think it's important because so much of what I say can sound so nihilistic and judgmental, even. I think that with such a sensitive topic, sexuality and our personal lives, it's very important to me that my readers feel that, you know, yes, perhaps I am judging you a bit.
Mm,
Perhaps
mm,
I am, I'm not approaching this from an entirely abstract perspective. But
yeah.
at the end of the day, I'm not judging you because I think I'm superior to you. It's
Mm,
because I genuinely want to help you, and I think everybody uh needs to judge each other a bit in order uh to lend any sort of progress. A judge can be a harsh word, and I
mm.
do not mean it in like a hateful sense, but perhaps being critical is perhaps a better word there.
Yeah, you draw some distinctions. Plus, you cut some slack to men and young men too, which these days, coming from women writers, is not always typical. People
Yes.
don't tend to cut each other some slack. I'm going to do something here. We're going to go through your work. I want to talk about the essays, but I'm going to begin actually with something I read today from another source, which was in the Atlantic from a writer, Derek Thompson, who I think I've had on the show, or we've invited him or something. But anyway, he's written something. Um, Marriage material shortage. Adults are significantly less likely to be married or to live with a partner than they used to be, and it's in today's Atlantic. And he has a quote in here that I want to ask you about because I think you have some real expertise on this. He says, if I had to sum up this big, messy story in a sentence, it would be this: coupling is declining around the world as women's expectations rise and lower income men's fortunes fall. This combination is subverting the traditional role of straight marriage, in which men are seen as necessary for the economic insurance of the family. So, why does all this matter? Two of the more urgent sociological narratives of this moment are declining fertility and rising unhappiness. Now, the reason I jumped on this is because this morning, what I've been doing all day long is reading all your work. And then I jumped into the Atlantic as I do because a lot of the writers there have appeared here and we've talked to them. And I thought, wow, that's something that Magdalene could have written. And she addresses these issues a lot in the same kind of way. So first of all, let's just talk about what he wrote there and let's unpack that a little bit. If you don't mind, how does that strike you and how does that tie into some of the things you've written? And then we'll get to those.
Yeah, I'm a very big fan of his work specifically, and I think that what he says specifically about women's expectations, perhaps, women having too high of expectations in a time where men's prospects are lowering is an extremely difficult subject to broach when we're talking about the problem of our uh, collective unhappiness and loneliness, because it isn't really fair to tell women that their expectations should be lowered.
Yeah,
And also, I don't think that I don't think that there's anything even really effective in
yeah,
doing that. I don't think anybody, of course, there are edge cases where somebody's, insisting on somebody who's, 6'6" and makes $1 million a year or whatever, something like that. But I don't really think that it doesn't help to tell the average woman that, they need to settle for somebody who, has nothing going on for them.
let me ask you a different question that's related because it follows from this in terms of just your
Mhm.
general wisdom, which I really respect. And then we're going to get into your individual pieces. What about the idea of settling for the idea that we're not owed happiness and that the point of life is to find joy in moments that work, but you've got to struggle for them? And the context of my saying this is that I've had such a different life from those you described. I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18 in a fundamentalist community, and we married because that's what you did in those communities. And we're still married 55 years later and very happy together. And I'm the father of three grown children and five grandchildren, three of whom live across the street that I've been doing childcare for 16 years. And when I say me, I mean me, not just Jeannie, but both of us. And we're kind of an anomaly. We don't fit the evangelical mold because we got pregnant and we did all the things you weren't supposed to. We certainly don't fit the current mold of, slow love and take your time and find the perfect person. But as I look back on the things that have worked in my life, it's precisely been the kind of serendipity of sticking around until something falls into place rather than having a certain set of expectations and then bailing as soon as they're not met. So my point of view on relationships biographically is not settle for less. It's dare to step out and then realize this is going to be a long, hard slog because nothing is handed to you on a plate. Don't expect, quote, the perfect person to be out there. I'm just running that by you because I'd be curious about your opinion of that formulation, which is not directed particularly at women or men, but at anybody looking for any kind of romantic attachment.
Absolutely. I think that part of one of the problems of contemporary relationships today is that there isn't much of an attitude of, what are relationships really for, and the idea that, perhaps one crucial element of relationships is growing and learning together and developing over time, and that there is not going to be some kind of perfect match that comes that comes immediately and stays perfect throughout the rest of your life. That there's it's an attitude that I think has kind of pervaded many aspects of our culture, that we're really looking for like a quick sense of satisfaction, that there are unlimited choices, that we can always find something better, and it's we very much have like a DoorDash attitude
Mm.
towards relationships and every other aspect of our life. And yeah, it's again one of those things that's really hard to tell people, because it's so much of it is luck.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
we work hard in our relationships that we form, and we try to be intentional about them the way that we can. But for you, there is a matter of luck, and something that can't be entirely taught, that
Yeah.
you and your wife are still together, particularly coming from the background that you come from, and that you've moved away from that background and
Mm.
still have held on to each other. It's a formula that can't be repeated.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so yeah, that's why it's it's really hard to tell people, here's what to do.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I do think that there can be an attitude that is taught, a perspective that is encouraged, that you work together through difficult things, that you keep an open mind, that perfection is not the goal.
Yeah. And also, I think I want to jump into this article that you wrote here called The Gender War Wants to Divide You. And the subtitle is Anger and Loneliness Are Part of What Got Us Here. More of it won't get us out. And we're going to go there in a minute. And I'm going to read a bit to you and ask you to talk about it. Um, but this is a good segue into that because I think part of that luck is absolutely part of it. And not giving up too quickly is another part. But I also think, and I'd like your opinion on this, this is not a rhetorical question, but it also depends on how you define the word success. And my definition of that word has changed over the years. When my first novel came out, success might have been to write a book that got good critical reviews and sold well. And my first novel did do that. So I've had permission now for the last 40 years to write books, some of which have dropped like stones into a pond, never to be seen again, and others have been successful. But my definition of success has really changed. And I know this will sound a little bit syrupy to you, but right now at 72 years old is that I'm the person my grown up grandchildren and my teenage grandchildren text when they need something,
Mhm.
including, I haven't seen you all week. Will you take me to lunch? And then at lunch, I hear all about how my 16-year-old granddaughter's week has gone. So, that my definition of success now is the intensity of personal relationships I care most about and making them work. It's not writing another bestseller if I could, or this, that, or the other. And I think a lot of people's idea of success kind of defines what they're willing to do in terms of relationships and sexuality. I'm moving now. I had a friend, a young man I talked to last year who was telling me how he's moving to California, even though the girl he loves is staying in New York, and he's been with her for 7 years, and they met in college, but that, his career kind of demanded it. And his idea of success was so career oriented, he was willing to sacrifice something he found was working, as if somehow there would be someone else out there. And I was just thinking, well, what would have happened if 7 years into my relationship with Jeannie, I had bailed on it? There wasn't anybody else out there like Jeannie who I could have grown with. There might have been somebody different, but what do you think about this idea of success in terms of career orientation or material goods or where we live or all that kind of stuff? In your formulation of relationships and sexuality, how do you see the priorities that lead to joy in life rather than a lack of joy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now there isn't a lot of thinking about what our future idea of success will be in a family or romantic
Mm-hmm.
context. I think that um, a lot of my generation, a lot of my generation, unfortunately, has an attitude that, there really isn't a future, that there won't be a future, that they certainly should not, have children because they do not think that there will be a future for them to have.
Mm.
Um, and I very much try to reject that attitude. I fundamentally don't think that that's true, that there won't
Yeah.
be a future for our children to have. Um, and I'm obviously a very career-oriented person.
Sure.
That's why I do what I do, and I publish and I work hard, and I have to. There's even, a certain narcissism in
Mm.
that, in being a writer and having to promote yourself and everything. But for me personally, when I think about what I ultimately want out of life, I I think mostly about being a grandparent someday is like my
Yeah.
ultimate the ultimate thing that I'm looking toward, of, what I think will bring me a sense of fulfillment. Though again, I don't know if fulfillment is ever really fully found.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I don't know if that attitude is really shared among my peers, and I think that the even with career aspirations, I think that there are plenty of people in my generation who are also very career oriented, and who that is maybe the only thing that they're oriented towards. But I also think that there are plenty of people for whom that's not even what's driving them,
Yeah.
and there's a real listlessness
Yeah.
instead.
Yeah, I wonder if that listlessness comes from a lack of historical rootedness, because it's interesting. My wife and I are, one of our hobbies is listening to The Rest is History, which is a wonderful podcast with Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland. And, we enjoy it because in a way it puts our own moment of history in perspective, by studying Edward III or the Black Death or the Renaissance or whatever, and listening to them talk, you realize that we are actually better off at this moment of history than a lot of people at a lot of moments. So if you were going to be listless and basically give up on the future, now would not be the time that anybody in the past would have imagined that people living in a Western culture, in the United States, Trump turmoil notwithstanding, would pick this moment as one of listlessness. When you look at the actuarial tables of how long lives were and how many kids died and so forth, the idea that we feel hopeless is kind of odd. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a contemporary narcissism that I think is dictating it. I mean, I also don't think the idea that, like, I think there's been several points in human history where people have thought that, their generation would be
Sure.
last. But to me, it does seem like where we are now is a predictable end point of, at least the last 100 years of Western history, of constant development,
Mm.
and the idea of progression, that we would have reached a point where so many structures have been overturned,
Yeah.
and so many traditions abandoned, and uh, all in this idea that we will be at this point of progress. It does make sense to me that the listlessness would be the
Mm.
result.
I think something interesting about you is that having had a brother who suffered from cerebral palsy, I happened to have grown up next to a children's home in Switzerland that was one of the first more enlightened places for cerebral palsy kids. And since I was the youngest child, my sisters were all older, there was nobody else around to play with. So, I grew up pushing wheelchairs around and organizing games with CP kids. So that rings a bell with me. But I think you having been forced to, even as a younger child in the family with parents who had their own struggles and then a brother and so forth and so on, maybe that's a key. We're talking about who are you personally, so I can understand your work better. As a 70-year-old guy, I kind of I don't read too many columns by people just off the bat that are dealing with contemporary sexuality because the point of view is kind of different. And you sort of worry, well, have they lived long enough to know something in terms of their own journey? And I always find such wisdom in your pieces. So I want to reintroduce you and then dive into the actual work you've done and talk about your essays. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Magdalene Taylor. And she's a wonderful writer and she's a critic of culture and sex, which sounds like kind of a weird thing, but actually she's a really good writer and knows what she's talking about. She's written for the New York Times and GQ, Wall Street Journal, etc. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And so now I want to go to one of the pieces you wrote with The Gender War Wants to Divide You. In the first paragraph, let me just read it a little bit. Your body, my choice forever. It's a line intended to infuriate, and it did. It's a line that the men who said it, Nick Fuentes' anonymous troll accounts, want women to think is indicative of the broader culture that won the election. They want you to think that the 53 to 57% of men overall who voted for Trump did so because they, at best, have zero regard for your well-being and happiness. And at worst, actively want to hurt you and infringe upon your rights. They want you to think this all intentionally malicious so that you respond with hostility in kind. So let's unpack that article because I'm going to go through half a dozen pieces you've written, but let's talk about that.
Okay. So would you want me to just, what part of it do you want me to dig into?
I want you to, rather than force me to read bits back to you while you're sitting there, just tell me what the article's about and how you see things now. I think that's about a year ago that you wrote that. But this idea of these sort of aggressive men who take on women and then generate a following because of their mean-spiritedness and their lack of chivalry, if I could put it in terminology of closer to my generation. I find them very annoying. I despise these people. They're exactly who I'm proud that my son, who fought in Afghanistan as a US Marine working for the NSA, a manly occupation, is the exact opposite of that. And I feel that as a father, I did a good job when I see him as a married man with 3 kids, being a good father and caring for them and loving his wife and being gentle and kind. And, he's a Marine and he can take you down from 500 yards away with iron sights. He's the real deal. And he's so different than these assholes that make me so angry. All these cage fighting pieces of shit who then vaunt this idea of masculinity that starts by being the kind of people that I hope my granddaughter never meets, if I can put it that way. That, I'm so totally on your side on these issues. And I'm glad that you point out that these are clickbaiters and they don't represent everybody. And I say that's a good thing. So unpack your article a little bit in terms of the present tense of post-Trump's election. Where the hell are we with these grandstanding, tech bro, weightlifting, cage fighting guys signaling what to whom and why? I just don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, the way that you describe them is interesting. The weightlifting and the cage fighting, and it's such a select few of them that even represent any sort of vitality, I think. And what I was trying to say in that piece, particularly with somebody like Nick Fuentes, who is trying to he gets a rise out of women being upset by what he says and angry with what he says. And so many people online are doing the same thing. They really want to, their goal is just to troll people and to get attention. And I think that there's very very little political endpoint in mind. I think
Mm,
that most of these uh, most of these male gender war figures are ultimately, complete nihilists. They represent nothing. They themselves will not form relationships or have children or have families or, continue on a real legacy in any way. And the men who follow them and, are lured into their ideology will also similarly, never partner up, never have children,
yeah.
never really continue anything.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a threat there of more people taking that path. But I think that, in the shorter term, what these people are doing by making these provocative posts and making these statements is just trying to further anger women and
Mm,
it forms this really nasty cycle
mm,
that I think is what I was trying to particularly highlight post-election, that the a man like Nick Fuentes, who does not represent the general population and does not even, honestly represent the average Trump voter,
right.
in the belief that, that women's bodies should be property. That is not a mainstream opinion, even among the average, conservative
Sure.
Trump voter. Um, they they say these things. They want to rile up women who are on the left, who will then, take on, a hateful attitude towards men. Men will then, be the recipients of this hate right back and further proliferate this cycle of gendered hatred towards each other
Hmm.
that that again it has no future. There's no children to be made from this, no partners to be found. It it leads to nothing
Mm,
except
mm,
more loneliness and more anger. And I, as the Trump presidency proceeds,
mm,
uh, it is kind of to me like anybody's guess what will really happen.
mm.
If maybe women's bodies will become property. Obviously that is something that that sounds like a horror movie, and I don't really think that's going to happen. But I also am kind of at a point where I truly have no idea what is going to
Yeah.
happen.
Well, you wrote this essay, the title of which is sort of self-explanatory, but we'll go there as well as a kind of a follow-up. Do women even like men anymore? And then the subtitle is Our Culture of Casual Men Hating Probably Isn't Making Us Happier. And that's kind of bookend the one we just talked about. And there's a paragraph in here, women no longer liking men actually strikes me as a far more mainstream occurrence, more mainstream than the men trolling women, I guess. The trend of women pursuing celibacy, for example, is never branded as a radical pursuit, but rather a natural consequence of our current cultural dynamics. Of course, women don't want to sleep with these guys. The many articles on the subject say, why would they when men are this bad? Sort of that bookends the other article. So let's talk about that a little bit. Um, is that less clickbaity? Is that actually happening more? We read one of the reactions to Trump's election this time was not wearing, pussy hats and going into the street, but it was a bunch of people saying, well, they're not going to have sex with anybody, any male anymore, sort of following on from what you're talking about. How much of this is real and how much of this only exists online? In the same way that you talk about Trump voters not being those guys, my neighbors that plow my drive for free, that uh, Gary was out plowing his sidewalk so that when I walk my dog Zip this morning, I wouldn't slip on the ice. These are all Trump voters, and they've been married for 30, 40, 50 years. They live in my neighborhood. They have children and grandchildren. They're the people you'd want living next to you. They are so far away from Fuentes and, well, Elon Musk and Donald Trump for that matter. They would be horrified if anybody in their family was carrying on in this way, in terms of sexual relationships and all the rest of it. So I see a total disconnect between these sort of trolling people online, males anyway. How about the female side of this? How much of this is real and actually happening outside of a bubble of a tiny little group of people?
Well, it's something that's hard to gauge entirely. I do think that the women who took on this attitude of I'm done sleeping with men um, for political reasons are people who would position themselves as relatively like mainstream moderate people
Mm,
otherwise. Whereas I
mm,
think Nick Fuentes's fans see
sure.
themselves as, on the furthest margins of
Yeah.
society. I don't think the women who have this perspective uh, feel that way. And I do think that the internet part of it all, you know, the reality probably isn't that all of these women are collectively going to stop dating
Yeah.
men. There has been, a noticeable decline in sex and relationship forming over the last several years. We do not yet, of course, have the data of if there's been any changes specifically since the inauguration
Yeah.
or the election itself. But it is entirely possible that there have been further declines. But I do think that I see it very much in my day-to-day life, and the women I know, the type of sentiment that men are trash, men are bad, men do shitty things. These kinds of generalizations about men entirely common and normal, and some of that is it. It's kind of fundamentally meaningless. These are people who are still continuing to date men, who have male friends, who maybe
Mhm.
even have boyfriends or husbands who they don't uh whom they see as the exception to this broader rule that men
Yeah.
are bad. Um, and I think that's entirely socially acceptable, culturally acceptable, whereas we obviously do not hear men in everyday conversation, at dinner and coffee shops, whatever, saying, women are awful. We do
Yeah.
see this a lot online, and there are plenty of men who feel that way. And
Yeah.
it's, in many ways justifiable that women would in turn, have this hostility back towards men writ large.
Mm.
But I do, like I say in the piece, I don't think it's doing us any good. I don't
Yeah.
think that harboring this resentment towards men is productive towards our greater happiness. And I think that, you made the point that following the inauguration, we have not seen the sort of pussy hat feminism,
Right.
women's march stuff. And that to me kind of proves how, you know, how nasty how nasty this overall project has become, that now we're only seeing responses online
Well,
that
you write in the article, a line you have here, it's become deeply uncool as women to acknowledge any sort of affinity or appreciation for men. To do so run the risks of being a pick me or not a girl's girl, two of the greatest sins a girl can commit. In order to be pro women, one must now be vocally anti men. So just put that in context. I pulled it out of context just by quoting it, as a standalone quote, but that kind of makes the point you're making. So how do you wind that up? And I think it's in that article. I can scroll down and look, but or another one where you say, well, just what you just said. This is all kind of a bad idea from the men or the women's point of view because loneliness, including sexual loneliness, is on the rise. And of course, Jean Twenge makes this point in all her analysis of in her books of just the number of people having less sex, no dating. So the question of where does this end not only is a demographic question of who's going to have the children in the future, but it also is a practical question of loneliness is really bad for you. You die younger. Everybody who studies this says that if you choose between drinking too much and smoking, or being a really lonely, unattached person, drink and smoke because you'll live a little longer than you will if you're alone. And
yes.
these are scientifically based studies. So, there's two things colliding here. There's the fashionable thing of, I hate men and I'll never date, or women are scum and, let's crush them. good luck storming the castle because you're all going to wind up by yourselves. This is a really bad idea. And we're not talking morals or procreation here. We just mean, you know, being alone.
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of women who feel, very committed to uh, political lesbianism, as it's called, of feminist women truly wanting to divest from men. I love the idea of them, forming their own communes and, genuinely forming a community that satisfies the political lifestyle they want to live.
Yeah,
That's a great idea for them. It's simply not happening anymore.
right.
I think my generation really overestimates the strength of their friend groups as they age. I truly, I truly hope that I maintain all of my friendships and see these people as much as I see them now. But I think that the reality is that as you get older, these people will not be able to form the same bonds and caretaking abilities
Mm,
as relationships, as romantic relationships and family do.
yeah.
And I think that we are barreling towards an extremely lonely and isolated uh, older demographic. I think that it is right now, our generation is extremely lonely and isolated. That is something that is only going to get worse as we get older, as we need people in our lives to take care of us and to form our communities, and that just simply does decline with
Mm.
age for most people. And hopefully we can be very intentional in avoiding some of that. But yeah, I don't think the people who are calling to divest from men are really doing much of the work of forming the community bonds that will save them from loneliness in the future.
Yeah, I mean the bonds all sort of replicate college type experiences ad infinitum. So you were in college 4 years and then you moved again for a job, then you have new friends and you go to this cool place and you hang out for a while. Um, but this is very age specific and it doesn't keep working, so I agree with you. But I have a kind of an overarching philosophical question, a historical question, then we'll come back to your essays some more and read some more quotes because I love your writing and I just think you dig very deep on this stuff. Um, but I'm throwing this out, and again, this is not a record question. I'm not fishing for anything. I really want your opinion. As I look back, one of the things I'm grateful for is my introduction to sexuality as a male was not online porn. So I remember my first kiss, and it wasn't with Jeannie, but it was with a 14-year-old, and I was 14, who was down the street visiting her uncle. And it was very tender and very sweet. And I had a big crush on her. We hung out all summer together. And it was a kind of innocence not available to someone who's been watching porn on their phone since they're 8. My idea of her was completely that of a young, naive male. It was a voyage of discovery. She was kind. I was polite to her. It felt very much the norm at that point. I held her hand for a little while and we would walk together. And then one day I kissed her and I was flabbergasted that she let me and kissed me back. And I look back with great gratitude at that, not because there was any particular morality in my life, but because of what was available. So when I look at the final baggage of the sexual revolution that came out of the 60s and 70s, um, I think it's dying with a kind of a whimper. It's not going out with a bang. I mean, Kinsey, was a fake asshole child molester, and his vision was, has been researched as one that was falsified. Hugh Hefner was a complete jerk, putting drugs in girls' drinks and then handing them off to his celebrity friends. The whole thing is built of sand. The tide's come in and gone out, and now you have 8-year-old kids looking at porn online. Their addiction to sexuality must have something to do with the fact that people are having less sex. I mean, I'm not fishing for anything specific, but for me, as someone who's in their 70s, that I'm as grateful for having missed that as part of my childhood as I would be for having not been in the environs of Hiroshima and having radiation sickness. Because to me, sexuality was always something that had a completely different spin to it than this kind of grinding it out, Pornhub shit introduction to sex for 10-year-old boys and girls. And that's a generational thing. And then it's my generation of boomers, so-called liberals, who opened the door to all this shit. So it's a very, in my head, it's a mess on this. I'm just curious where you come at, different generation, female, where are you at on that?
I think you're right that it's a complete mess, that we are reckoning with what the sexual revolution was, what it brought us. I think that my take is sort of that the successes of the sexual revolution were not anticipating the advent of the internet.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
I,
good
I
point.
do I do think that it's the confluence uh of new liberated sexual attitudes with the complete liberation of knowledge and information and images that the internet has allowed for.
Yeah,
And that we came to the dominance of internet pornography right at a time that the sexual ideology was one of pure sex positivity, uh of that your desires are good, exploring your desires is good, and that you should not be judged or critiqued for your sexual proclivities. And it just does not really work to treat a vice like pornography in that way. And I sort of think that we found ourselves in a really messy moment. I think that a lot of what is going on uh with my generation and younger is that they have been raised, entirely on a diet of internet pornography. And they also kind of see the dissatisfaction of the ideology of sex positivity. They find all of that cringe.
mm,
Um, and so I think that there has kind of been this, restructuring of the human brain, basically, where uh, people's sexualities have been kind of entirely sublimated to the internet. And meanwhile, actual living, breathing sex is uncomfortable, is cringeworthy, is not even necessarily desirable to
mhm.
people. And there's been some overcorrecting that has happened in light of that. I think that the gender war attitudes that we're seeing from guys like Nick Fuentes are part of this overcorrection that is at play, where even as we had the longstanding attitude of the sexual revolution carried with us into the internet era, there are still some aspects of repression that perhaps we never reckoned with. Um, I think that there's a real idea that any type of like sexual repression or guilt or confusion is something that like sort of needs to be beat out of us, through I don't know, through pornography, through our sexual actions, whatever. Whereas I sort of think that our culture needs to do a better job of accepting that, some level of repression is a natural part of our
Sure.
sexual culture. Um, and yeah, I guess all this is to say that I think that we are in a very confusing part of time that is the product of uh, the residuals of the sexual revolution meets the internet.
Yeah, I mean, in your article, Have More Sex, Please, I just go to a quote down here that I had up. You kind of address this directly, and you talk about the fact that, just getting down to the quote, that, the loneliness epidemic may be a societal issue, but it can be solved at least partly at the level of individual bedrooms. It's a kind of a very pro-sex piece. But of course, if you've been turned off to sexuality entirely, in the same way that someone that's raised by an alcoholic parent who beats their mother has been turned off to alcohol in a visceral sense, if it's been spoiled for you entirely, that's okay if it's 1 out of every 100 people or maybe 1 out of 10. But if it's 90% of everybody's first foray into sexuality is via Pornhub on a phone sometime when you're 10, you kind of have a problem. And the problem is not one of permissiveness being crushed by the moral majority or the religious right. It's one that your hunter-gatherer forebears 100,000 years ago would have recognized, because they would pair up, and a lot of them were monogamous, and some of them would have two wives in some groupings. If you read The Old Way, which is an incredible book of living with the Bushmen in the Kalahari, that was written by someone who was there in the 1950s before they were invaded and taken over, before they had met anybody. The relationships in the hunter-gatherer groups were what we would call traditional relationships. And they'd been doing this 100,000 years ago, a long time before Jesus or any religion. So this was not a moralistic spin on sexuality. This was just how human apes evolved to be. And sexual chaos was never the friend of community. And you could not keep your shit together if everybody was rushing off and fucking whomever or stealing people's mates or whatever it might be. They cared for their children. Men and women shared childcare. It was very enlightened from our point of view before any feminists ever drew breath anywhere. In other words, there is such a thing as nature. And it seems to me that across the board, we're in a time when nature is being rebelled against, as if it's been handed down as a church edict we have to get past because it's too Christian. It's nothing to do with Christianity or Islam. This is just humans and how we evolved. The survival of the fittest isn't the way it happened. It's the survival of the friendliest, people who get on, people who cooperate. And one of the ways you cooperate is through some sort of sexuality that actually works and gives you pleasure and joy, and at the same time provides kids and stability to little communities. It takes a village, whatever. I mean, I don't know your views on this, but it just seems to me, that a culture can only be deconstructed once. And now what we're watching is the rubble bouncing. Oh, let's rebomb traditional morality because, who wants to be, whatever it may be, a Roman Catholic or an evangelical. Okay, fine. But that world is gone anyway. It's vaporized. I don't know how you see that, but it just seems to me that we're focusing on the wrong things here. And basically we should be looking at a different question. That is, what does it mean to be a human being?
Yeah, no, I think I'm really in complete agreement with you there, that there really is this attitude that, we are above the thousands and thousands of years of humans partnering up and having sex, that this is that this is one of the final constructs that we must overcome in order to be liberated, and that's just simply not true in my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you've got this article right now, and it ties in. So sorry to interrupt you. The tech oligarchy is stealing your sexuality. And it sort of ties in with today's expectations. You ask, the question remains, what exactly does this billionaire class want from the rest of us? There are a few theories. One that interests me most in predictable fashion has to do with gooning. Okay, well, good old strange me had never heard of gooning until I read your article, and then I discovered it was a thing. So let's talk about a little bit. I mean, what do these billionaire class want, and why is gooning a thing, and what are we talking about here? And then how does that fit in with what you were just talking about in terms of, hey, this is what human beings are, and how have we kind of twisted that?
Yeah, well, so gooning is something that I've regrettably had to write about several times. It was once, a real niche term, really like relegated to smaller subreddit groups. And it refers to predominantly men who masturbate for hours at a time. Some even, go on like weekend long binges. And they also utilize several screens of pornography, usually. And it becomes this sort of trance-like state where it's just this hours-long pursuit of, mindless pleasure and perversion, really. Um, and so it was once, a niche thing. In the last 2 years or so, the word has entered the mainstream in sort of memeified form. I don't think that everybody who uses the term is, authentically doing this,
Right.
but it has become synonymous with masturbation writ large. And it to me that's kind of a reflection of how young people today are viewing their sexualities. I think that it's sort of, it's a Freudian tell that people are jokingly referring to watching porn and masturbating as gooning, as this like extreme act, and then also just making jokes about doing it themselves. Surely, with all of this, the number of people who are actually gooning has risen. And so what I was writing about in that article is that some people are theorizing that, tech companies like Meta, and Twitter/X are really trying to push this type of content onto people to actually transform people into, living, breathing gooners. Because to me, it's something that really robs you of much other identity or
Yeah,
prospect.
exactly.
And to to be somebody who goons is to be somebody who has nothing else that really defines their lives. And that would be convenient for the people who own these companies. It would be convenient in that it keeps people online more and using their
Online
products.
forever. Yeah.
But it also is politically convenient because it makes you into a pliable person who likely does not vote,
Yeah.
or at least can be easily swayed to vote according to the platforms that you spend most of your time on.
Speaking of which, let me just ask you a kind of an overarching question about the tech bro. You're an observer of our culture, sexuality,
Mhm.
relationships, intimacy, and so forth. It seems obviously they've had an outside impact, things like Facebook, what it's done to a younger generation, then Twitter, and as it goes through all the derivations that we know so well. And of course, now we're into AI technology, et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder if the kind of autism factor of the tech bro elite, it, that they talk about themselves in terms of their own psychological disorders, if you want to put it that way, or their kind of the way they see other people combined with untold billions. I mean, how do you see the impact of technology? Just you were talking about, online porn perhaps wasn't foreseen in the earlier stages of the sexual revolution. We did not foresee what would happen here, a kind of naivete there. How does this sort of oligarchic approach to politics, sexuality, and all the rest of it, given that these folks also control the means of communication, how does that play out into this era of kind of limitless loneliness that stretches ahead of us now, where you have the built-in lie of all online life, which was this was going to connect us, but we're not connected. I get less phone calls now because I only get texts. In other words, it's always less than it was promised to be. It's called an iPhone, but I don't use the phone function because younger people only want to text. They don't want to talk. They don't want to make eye contact. We have FaceTime, but they don't want to use it because they don't. Eye contact makes people nervous these days. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but why is it that everything winds up as less? And then somehow the only consistent through line is more loneliness, less sex, whatever it may be. How does this tie in with who these people are in terms of the way they're living their own lives and their, greed combined with whatever their ideology that used to be, hey, we're the answer to the future. And now it's basically, we're going to buy influence in Washington so we can keep doing what we want to do unregulated, which seems to me why they are all in Trump's pocket, because they're all currying deregulation of their industries so that nobody watches what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, in large part because the only ideology that they hold is that of technological progress.
Yeah.
And that is, that is a meaningless term. There is no human behind, the advancement of technological progress from the attitude that I think they're approaching it from.
Yeah.
Uh, I I think that over the last 20 years or so, we have been sold several ideas about what technology would offer us and what type of human connection it would offer us.
Hmm.
And we really sold ourselves over to that promise that these things would better connect us.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of that has, like you said, proven to be true. We are not really better connected or fulfilled from that connection, at
Well, and
least.
the younger people are the worst off of all. Every time you go another generation, they're even further away from anything that formerly would have been
Right.
called fulfilling and human.
Right. But we have since, I don't think that people have yet accepted that there is any alternative besides this abstract idea of technological progress. I mean, particularly when we look at something like Sam Altman and AI, what do they want for us? How do they actually see this as improving our lives?
Hmm.
They don't. They really just want to sort of see how far they can push something like
Hmm.
this
Well,
to
with Altman though, and some
make
of
as much
these
money
guys
as they
like
can.
Peter Thiel, and on the other hand, and Musk, then they say, "Oh, isn't it a shame nobody's having babies anymore?" In other words, they notice the human connection's missing, as in reproductively we're declining, and demographically we're not replacing ourselves. So, how do you reconcile that kind of high that these tech bros want people to have babies, and yet they provided us with a world in which we can't even connect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is some of the corrective uh, the corrective measure that
Hmm.
these guys are trying to take. I mean, I think that is part of why Musk, for example, he who used to be into DEI and an equitable workplace and ideas like that, who was ostensibly somewhere someone we would identify as liberal. Why he has made such a turn is because there has, perhaps been some acknowledgement of that people aren't having babies, and so we must take an authoritarian approach to it,
Hmm.
which I don't think is the solution. But as for what the greater project of somebody like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk really is, um, I frankly don't know. I don't. It's something that I mean does frighten me a bit. But I don't think I've yet pinpointed
Hmm.
what they want from us in having uh, continuing our addictions to this technology, but
Hmm.
also trying to encourage more baby making. I mean, perhaps it is as simple as a lot of people would say it is, that it is, it's a fascistic approach of producing more bodies to support this regime.
Yeah. Yeah, it
And
looks that way a lot of
I
times.
see it simple as that.
There's a sort of an anomaly here that I want to throw out that I know you're aware of because you follow everything. But when you look at, JD Vance, Tucker Carlson, Peter Thiel, and a bunch of these high level, the future, faith in technology and so forth and so on, get rid of the federal government because it limits innovation, which is their bottom line. How does that combine with the fact that these guys are converting to Roman Catholicism and a strict traditional Catholicism, they think? And then these articles that are popping up with people at the Atlantic and others that I'm reading and we're talking to, saying that there's also this sort of mini trend amongst men where younger men are beginning to go to church, whereas younger women are not. Younger women are going to college, less younger men are going to college. Sexuality is diminishing on all from, in both sexes. But then there's this little mini trend where younger men are starting to go back to traditional, more conservative churches looking for something that obviously is not being fulfilled by gooning or whatever it may be. They want a little more. how does all that fit together? Because you have the kind of, tech vision of the world. We'll have faith in innovation that'll somehow get us out of all of this. The track record's horrible. It's sort of semi-destroyed a whole younger generation, made people less creative. All these articles popping up, unrelated subjects, university professors at Ivy League schools saying we're having a real problem because we're getting kids who have never even read a book in high school. They can't deal with the reading lists we're giving them. Across the board, touch it wherever you want. It ain't working very well. But how do you see this kind of little rise of interest in religion and tradition amongst younger males and then some of the big time tech bros that we all hear about? I mean, I'm just waiting for Elon Musk to say he's become a Roman Catholic now.
Yeah. Um, I think a lot of it is a bit performative. I don't know. I don't know what if the rates of church attendance are actually
Yeah.
higher, among young men, but there certainly has been an adoption uh, of various Christian identities among young men. And to me, that's, in a lot of ways, that's what religion has always offered is an identity in the absence of one, tradition in the absence of tradition, community in the absence of community. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it would be nice if more of these men actually went to church and found a community
Hmm.
and practice certain elements of the gospel that I do not think they are practicing when they you know uh, harass women online.
Yeah.
Uh, so of course, there's there's some issues with that, and I think that a lot of the young men who are adopting, uh, you know, adopting Catholicism are doing so in an intense way that is, a lot of people are going to look at negatively, and there is some negativity to be gleaned from that. But to me, it just is. It's an obvious turn towards you know towards a salvation. I think it's really as straightforward as religion has
Right.
often been. But there's still the technological mediation behind it that is kind of watering it down in a way that people are now practicing Catholicism without actually going to mass, without forming the community of church, without
Yeah,
doing
I
the
understand.
yeah.
How do you see your relationship to your reader, as in you obviously get some harassment from some of these idiot males, or I'd say entities masquerading as males from my point of view. Um, but what's the blowback from your female readers, as in you definitely are an advocate for relationships and you're telling women to not buy into, swearing off all the possibilities of the joy in both relationships or maybe family, whatever, sexuality, have more sex, talk about this in your article. And I'm just wondering what the reaction to your writing has been. And we'll kind of wind that up. I just remind people this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Magdalene Taylor, and she's an incredible writer. I've been talking about her essays, and this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And please subscribe on YouTube. And it has to be said in my commentary on Substack if you're interested. But I'd like to end this conversation by just asking you, I'm curious, what the reaction is when you write something for the New York Times about relationships and sexuality that then advocates to a readership that includes a lot of people who would identify as to the left or liberal or whatever on these views, very feminist kind of in their vision of things. That's not exactly where you're coming from. So how do people react, and what's the feedback been like?
Well, like I mentioned in one of my pieces, that to say that you like men at all, by some perspectives, is to say that you dislike women,
Yeah,
which obviously is not true. I I care about women's perspectives and happiness just as much as I do men. Though
sure.
I, as a writer, I have tended to focus more on men because that's it's been a richer territory, I think, to talk about. It's something that I don't think as many young women writers are talking about.
Hmm.
But so I do, a lot of people respond positively to my work, and there's been plenty of totally fair critiques of it, feminist or otherwise. But there has also been, I get accusations of hating women or of being a pick me, of trying to court, male attention in my work and in saying these things. Particularly with the New York Times Have More Sex essay, drew drew ire from everywhere. I mean, that's one of, I think, that's sort of how I know I'm doing something right in my work, is that genuinely everybody, any gender, any political identity gets mad at me. And so I don't feel actually that there is one particular group or one gender or one political leaning that takes issue with my work more than another. So that to me is kind of a good sign that universally there are people who get mad at me, and also universally, of course, people who do like and agree with my work. Um, but yeah, from the perspective that I have grown up in, I being from Massachusetts and I went to a liberal arts college and now I live in New York City. Um, Liberal feminism is the dominant ideology.
Yeah.
And I think that that makes it part of my job as a writer and critic to push back against the dominant ideology.
Hmm.
And feminism is not a monolith, and there are so many different perspectives to consider in all of these topics. But I I do not believe that, simply by being a woman, women are, uh, a category that can't be critiqued, and that feminism is something that can't be critiqued.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I also very much employ, a feminist framework in a lot of my work elsewhere. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah, that's all just to say that it's a real mixed bag in the responses, and
Yeah.
that I think that's a marker of success.
Hmm. Well, like I said, I enjoy your writing a lot, and I'm a fan of yours and a reader. I want to ask a favor to you. I will sign off here in a minute. Um, but Magdalene, when I do, please you stick around and talk to Ernie, my producer, for a couple minutes for two reasons. One, we want to make sure we put links of everything you would like to promote in terms of people being able to get in touch with you, follow you, subscribe to your Substack. We want to help you do all that because we're big fans of your work. And then also, if you do us a favor, some of our best guests come from our guests who tell Ernie, hey, look, if you're interested in this, you ought to talk to so and so. And it could be a writer or a non writer, just a friend, somebody you know. If you want to make a connection to a guest or two for us that you think we should be talking about or should know about, um, that we might have missed on a subject that you know about or something you're interested in, please tell Ernie how to connect to you so we can promote you, and also give Ernie some suggestions if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do both of those things.
Yeah. Okay. So this has been In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and Magdalene is a terrific writer. Magdalene Taylor, you look out for her in all the places she publishes. Plus, she has a Substack page that we will link to. Let's just talk about it for a second before we go, in case somebody doesn't bother to look at the links. Where can they follow you most closely?
So I publish the majority of my essays on Substack, and the URL for that is magdalene.substack.com. My publication is called Many Such Cases, but that URL was taken, so I just go by Magdalene on Substack.
Yeah.
And on social media, I'm on Twitter, Instagram at Magda J. Taylor.
Good. And we'll post all that. And Ernie's waiting to talk to you to make sure we get it down in black and white and also get some suggestion. Can I just thank you for your writing? You write beautifully. It's a pleasure always to read everything you write. And you are a sensible, grounded, knowledgeable person. And I really feel that, I'm just very proud to know you. I just think you're terrific.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your generous interpretations of my work, and for having me on today.
Well, it's been great. Thanks. Talk to Ernie. See you
Thank you
again.
so much.
Hope we meet again. Okay,
Yes.
bye-bye.
Thank you.